My name is Tim Hitchcock, and I'm professor of digital history, and I am really here from the land of the silent dead. I'm kind of on a journey over the last 15 to 20 years from a body of historical practice as a historian, where you look continually at text, where you continually, if you like, imagine the past as a construct between your ears without the addition of hearing anything. And so what I'm going to do just over the next 10 minutes is really kind of take you through where I've journeyed from that land of the silent dead towards something that I hope looks like a place that can be sounded, that can be listened to. And what I hope to get out of this session and this workshop really is a bunch of advice. The suggestion earlier was that there would be a lot of translation going on. And what I very much hope is that somebody will be able to translate between that world of music and sound, that present contemporary world of automated listening, and my world of the dead text. And the place I started was with this. These are the proceedings of the Old Bailey court. And what we did over the course of the 2000s was digitize essentially 127 million words of text that purported to record everything said in that court over 240 years. He said, she said, they said. What we ended up with was 127 million words of transcribed material marked up in XML as a kind of structured account of the workings of the British criminal justice system. And at first sight, it looked to us brilliant. And then back in 2003, we thought we'd solved everything. And what we thought we had was, if like, descriptions of everyday life, a way of accessing the everyday, the history from below that me and my colleagues have been struggling to recreate over the preceding 30 years. And it gets a lot of use, and it works, and all of that. But by 2008 or so, we'd realized that that process of simply reading the dead was missing a series of tricks. And we very rapidly moved towards a kind of distant reading, saying that, well, here we have 127 million words that we can actually deal with as a single massive text object. And in pursuit of that, we started counting words. And this is a scatter chart of 197,745 trials counted by the number of words in each of those single trials, and then spread across 240 years and distributed according to the number of words in each trial, from 8 at the bottom, there's 8, to 155,000 up there. And that taught us a huge amount. It was a wonderful journey. As, if you like, a close reading historian, it was for me an absolute revelation. But it also threw back on us a question. What was it we were actually looking at? What did each of those dots mean? What was a trial? And what could we do that was different to it? And the next thing that came up was just the sense, the realization, that rather than having simply a massive text object, what we had was 127 million words, of which perhaps 60 million were verbatim speech. Supposedly verbatim speech. And there were all kinds of problems about the process whereby speech is recorded into text and turned into something else. And so we went back to that XML, that massive text object, and we started marking up all that text. I am a horsekeeper. I live in Milford Lane, Strand. I lost my watch on a Monday. I do not know the day of the month. It was between the hours of 2 and 5. And after we'd marked up that 127 million words, what we had was something we could pull out that was speech, in theory, described by the person who uttered it, described and divided by the crime that they committed, associated with the verdict and the punishment, associated with the place where the crime took place, associated with the home of the defendant. We had a massive voiced object in some way. And the question became, well, what do we do with it? I mean, as an old school text historian, I was completely uncertain. So the first place we went was to say, well, okay, 3D modeling of the courtroom. If you're going to have a voice, you better know where it is being uttered, because that fundamentally changes how you understand any given utterance. And so we created the 3D model of the courtroom, which of course was torn down about 1900, and we had nothing but images and architectural plans. And we're in the process of trying to insert within that a soundscape that would allow us to, if I could, listen more clearly to all of those different words. In the process, the very act of modeling it changed how we read every single one of those. Because it turned out what we thought of as a grand courtroom was tiny, was intimate, and theatrical in its layout, was dominated by layers and absolutely designed to govern how different voices were heard and what authority they had in that space. So we'd gone a step, 2 steps, if you like, towards pulling out voice and trying to find the space for it, and ended up with what felt like at least a multidimensional understanding of that place and space. But where we're at now is actually, well, where I'm at is at an absolute conundrum. What do we do with that material? How do we actually understand it? Are there methodologies that we can bring from other disciplines that allow us to take that strand of speaking and perhaps voice it in some way and use different ways of analyzing that voiced speech to unpick what is an artifact left to us by the silent dead? So far, we've broken out all the speech, we've tagged it for utterances, and have begun the process of analyzing its distribution across the centuries. And the first, that yellow line is the percentage of trials containing speech, which evidences a changing pattern of criminal justice. The next line is, the blue line, is the average number of utterances per trial, so the extent to which each of these trials is a conversation or collection of separate statements. And there is evidence of change in that. And finally, the average word count per utterance, essentially the pattern whereby people decide how they're going to perform on, in this particular context. And all of it is really down to an attempt to find out how we can actually revoice and re-understand and play with and just use the words of somebody like John Ebenezer Martin here, who stood up in court in 1871 and interrogated witness after witness without counsel or support. As a working class man able to actually stand up to authority. And I want to know what their voice not so much sounded like, but what voicing that meant to him and what voicing that meant in that theater of the court. And what I'm looking for today really is ways of perhaps using methodology of sonification to give a new layer of meaning to that text, and to really just explore alternative approaches that I'm hoping that somebody here will be able to advise me on, of getting back to that, that lived experience. Thanks.
Thank you very much. What I want to talk about today is in part the practicalities, the issues that we've got at the moment and how I would like to see things developed in the future, but also some of the ethical implications, I think, of this that we have to consider as archivists, as the people who look after and who deal with this material, not just for the projects that collect it, but as time goes on, so in 5 years, in 50 years, in potentially 500 years' time as well. And I thought what I would do would be to start by telling you what we do at the moment. And what you would do if you were going to come to the Keep tomorrow to get out some of the recordings that you are actually going to work on tomorrow, because I think you're going to work on some of the 50 voices, is that correct? So I thought what I would do is demonstrate what those 50 voices actually look like in reality. They look like they live in boxes. So our digital recordings all live in boxes at the moment. I envisage that in some time, hopefully not too distant future, maybe in the next couple of years, we will start to actually keep all of our digital sound recordings on servers, and we'll be able to do different things with them. But at the moment, They're all kept in boxes, and you'll have to excuse my photography. I went into the stores yesterday and I was doing lots of photography and realised I wasn't very good at it. So if you order a sound recording at the moment at the Keep, and I should say that other institutions are probably a lot further advanced than we are, but this is what happens with us. You get given a box, and in that box are some folders. And those of you that have used paper archives are probably thinking this all looks really familiar at the moment, and it does, because we treat them in the same way as paper archives at the moment. In those boxes are files. This is a file which relates to the oral history of the Vice-Chancellor of Sussex, Lord Asa Briggs. When you open that file, you would receive some bits of paper and a CD-ROM. And apologies for those of you at the back who wouldn't be able to see this, but within those bits of paper are summary records. So this particular one tells you who Asa Briggs was, when the interview was, how long it is, who interviewed him, the interview log and so forth. And then we have the transcription itself. So you're able to look through the transcription whilst listening. But actually the reality is the transcription for this particular set of interviews is only partial. And the reason I'm showing you all of this is because this is the data that we've got to work with when we are trying to create records that will help you as researchers find stuff on those sound recordings. And the reality is, and again, I'm really sorry that you can't see this in more detail, that we create a record on this particular database. It's on, this particular database that we use is called CALM, which is ironic title really, considering how stressed it can make us. And it's based on something called ISAD-G, which is International Standard of Archival Description General, which is generally what most archives tend to use. And the problem with ISAD-G is it doesn't actually help us describe sound recordings. It's very good at helping us describe bits of paper. And indeed, even now, those bits of paper, researchers are beginning to want to know what's within them, not simply what they are called or when they were written. And ISAD-G fails us in this. It doesn't allow us to make those notes or to create that sort of searchability for the researcher. And of course, if you think about that with a piece of paper, it's much easier for a researcher to get the piece of paper out and start looking through it and finding out what keywords there may be that they could use. It's much more difficult when we're handing them a CD-ROM, which has got nothing characteristic on it. In fact, all we can do is hand you the CD-ROM and give you this and wish you luck. And you sit there and you listen and you listen and you listen. So this would be 2.5 hours that you would listen through Asa Briggs's oral history, which is fascinating, but it's quite long. And it may not have what you're interested in. So what we are interested in is what the technologies that you potentially can bring to us that would help us catalogue, that would help us describe, that would help us analyse. And some of the work that I think Sharon will be talking to you about, Sharon's already started working on some of the oral history recordings that we're going to be adding to our resistance archives, will hopefully help the researcher pinpoint exactly what they want without having to have an individual sit there for 2 hours and type every word and every second that word is being said and match it through. But rushing on, this is all great and would make my life, not my life, the people who work for me and their lives an awful lot easier. But what I have to consider as they are enjoying the fact that they can sort of easily archive and catalogue, describe using this technology is what the ethical implications of that actually are. So we're not just talking about description. As soon as we start describing in more detail, we're allowing a greater level of access in some ways. We're also allowing the potential, as it becomes digital, for people to manipulate those. Manipulate's probably the wrong word, but I'm always overcautious. To use those archives, those digital recordings in a different way to the way that's traditionally used. And that actually probably makes a huge difference to the people who are being recorded, because in their minds they're thinking of the traditional uses for their interview. Suddenly we're changing how that happens. So we need to reconsider the permissions we get from them. We need to reconsider the contracts that we make with them. And in many cases we have to revisit contracts, which can be difficult if somebody has died or if they have, they're not actually that comfortable with the new project that you might want to impose on their recording. The other thing that struck me from Alice's blog post actually, which was about used the Amazon murder trial example, where a lot of data had been collected and was potentially being repurposed. Its use could be repurposed. And it wasn't so much the ethical side of that made me think, but I thought, blimey, that's an awful lot of data to store, isn't it? And it's how we appraise that data. So at the moment, if somebody gives us a paper archive, we're able to say, well, we don't want your old bills. We only want the letters that you wrote. But how do we do that with sound recordings that are potentially absolutely huge? So those are all, sort of more things in terms of how we as archivists and librarians need to work with those digital products, with those sounds. And I think I will leave it there because my time is probably up.
Thank you very much. This brief presentation will introduce you to some ideas and experiments that a number of us here at the Sussex Humanities Lab have undertaken over the past year. So since we are an interdisciplinary or indeed transdisciplinary team, we have unique access to varied expertise and skills that enable us to carry out experiments in an agile and proficient manner. One of these experiments was, or is, using music information retrieval techniques on oral history collections. So in essence, it will pick up on some of the things that Jane and Tim have touched upon in their presentations. So this presentation will run through, as an experiment, we'll run through the hypothesis, the experiment, the results, and then this idea of repetition as well. So we started with the hypothesis that since oral history interviews in their natural or original state are audio files, that applying music information retrieval techniques, that is pattern recognition, feature extraction and clustering, would enable us to explore oral history collections differently, adding value not only to those collections but also influence the application of MIR technologies to wider fields. The hypothesis then is influenced by three strands within the lab. So that is digital archiving and digital history, which Tim, myself and another co-author, James Baker, are part of. And that brings together experience and expertise in dealing with oral history collections. And the second strand, which Chris and Alice are a part of, is the digital performance and technology, which brings that expertise in MIR and machine learning. And last but not least, to mention Ben Jackson as well, who was also part of this team, who kind of straddles across these strands and brings experience in digital archiving as well as informatics. So it was this cross-collaboration then that allowed us to kind of think about this hypothesis and how we might apply it. So our problem statement then comes from the perspective of the digital archive and history strand. And we wanted to explore the known problem, although some people might not perhaps see this as a problem, within oral history of creating text surrogates of audio files and basing subsequent analysis either through manual or computational means on these text versions. So text encodings or transcripts of oral history interviews have their obvious advantages. They are easier to anonymize, distribute and store, and they are established technique for text and/or data analysis. But as a consequence of this privileging of the text, a significant proportion of the digital resources and tools available for oral history interviews and collections do not support any analysis of the original audio associated with these interviews. Instead, they focus on things like creating oral history interviews using digital recording devices, how to manage these files, and how to create transcripts using audio to text tools. Although manual transcriptions is still a predominant method in this field. While using text surrogates is an embedded tradition, the community is slowly beginning to question the privilege of this text-based approach, given the ever-increasing possibility for computational analysis of audio. For example, MIR. And this is also evident, for example, in the UK's Oral History Society's 2016 conference call for papers, which stated the auditory dimension of oral history has for decades been notoriously underused. So while this slow move is welcome, it is true that there are few means for humanists interested in accessing and analysing spoken word collections to use and to understand how advanced technologies for analysing sound. even though, for example, this type of technology can resolve some of the backlog in archives and libraries of undescribed, though digitised audio collections. Of course, there are many other opportunities within that. So it is in light of this context that we wanted to explore oral history interviews and collections in their original form, and the field of MIR provided us with this chance. Alice, are your words? So MIR, okay. So MIR draws from digital audio signal processing, pattern recognition, psychology of perception, software system design, and machine learning to develop algorithms that enable computers to listen to abstract high-level musical information from low-level audio data. So just as human listeners can recognize pitch, tempo, chords, genre, song, song structure, etc., MIR algorithms are capable of recognizing and extracting this information, enabling systems to perform extensive sorting, searching, music recommendation, metadata generation, transcription on large data sets. Well done, Alice. So what we did then, okay, so it is based upon these capabilities, we started to think about possible use cases or uses. So within this kind of experimentation, we thought about kind of three contexts for this. So we thought about the object file, the content itself, and then the context in which that object was created. So some of these are just kind of our initial thought process around the types of things we might be able to do. So for the file or the object itself, what metadata can we automatically extract from the audio file? How can these features enhance what we already know about an object? So can these be saved alongside the object to help with search and discoverability, as mentioned previously? What are the technical specifications that we can extract from that audio file? And again, how can that kind of provide additional metadata to that archive? Also, in terms of the object, the content, what type of content analysis can we carry out? So the second context was about the content. So, for example, what type of content analysis can we carry out? So could we identify emotion in the audio stream? So extract or detect prosodic features, so for example, pitch and rhythm, that would indicate maybe a change in the audio and would identify moments of, heightened emotion. We also thought about the relationship or the dynamics between the interviewer and the interviewee. So, for example, is there overlap and interruption? Can we identify that in the audio, and does that indicate something about that relationship between the two people in that interview? Automatic clustering of related audio, extracting entities from the audio, comparing audio files to extract common patterns, and then thinking about extra semantic content as well. The third context was the context itself. So where was the interview carried out? Were there additional things that we could identify, like environmental features? Could these be extracted? And all of these things we thought about at scale. So it wasn't just about maybe one interview, but we were thinking about these interviews at scale to resolve archival problems where there's undescribed objects. And the mechanism that we used for these was to date 2 workshops, which used Jupyter notebooks using open source libraries in Python, librosa, and matplotlib. And the context was the Resistance Archive oral history collection, which is based at the Keep. Probably in a box, maybe, Fiona, I don't know. Yeah. So there was a number, I'll just kind of quickly, because I have 2 minutes left. So what these notebooks allowed us to kind of think about was the preparation of these audio files, the feature extraction, and the automated methods then to extract information from that. So reading, loading, playing audio files, normalization across those files to make sure the volume was the same. Feature extraction, or the characteristics, energy, frequency, to allow us to inspect the audio. And then automated means then that was that kind of moving away from just one file to kind of large files to use machine learning to sort data to look at clustering. So that's the idea of scale that we had. And the results were, so these were the mechanism, these are the workshop, the notebook that we used. So various things like visualizing the audio in a time domain, using spectrograms then to see if we can identify the 2 speakers within that interview, And then this was the kind of, I think, one of the eureka moments that we had, that Chris really worked really hard on this to kind of, in the interview, to separate that male and female voice. And initially, this was the thing that we thought would be, well, that's simple because, you know, female voices and male voices are distinct in that pitch. But one of the interviews that we used for the Resistance Archive, there was an 80-year-old French lady who had probably smoked for, you know, in her entire life and had this very deep guttural voice. So when we initially did that use case, it was like, well, that doesn't make any sense. But this is the kind of automated clustering that we were able to do over a few files to kind of identify where male and female voices were. So that's kind of one of the useful things around it. The mechanisms then, the result of these was there was a steep learning curve for both the participants, I think, that were doing these workshops and for the demonstrators, for us as well. Not only in terms of, you know, kind of speaking across the various disciplines, but actually looking at those results and actually getting something that was useful and something that we could read. How many? Less than a minute? Yeah. Finished? Okay. So with the experimentations, it was difficult to read the visual representation of the audio. It wasn't always obvious what those results were, or what it was saying to us. And as I mentioned, we also kind of learned that we should never assume. So that male and female voice, we kind of assumed something that turned out to be untrue. And it was difficult perhaps to see the value with small scale examples or experiments, and therefore we need to look at, you know, experimentation with larger collections, and that's the type of future work that we want to look at. And I've left this repeat slide blank because hopefully you might be looking at some of these things tomorrow, and we will have hopefully other opportunities to kind of test this hypothesis and experiment out. So.
Thank you, Sharon.
There you go.
I'm going to be talking about the work that we do, just an overview of how we use machine listening methods to try and work with bird sounds. And so the context for this is my 5-year fellowship project, which is based at Queen Mary University of London. In zoology and in some other environments, there are people trying to sort of make inroads into this. Very few coming at it from, say, the signal processing machine learning background. So, why should we? Right. So firstly, it has important applications. It has applications. I'm really grateful that I'm following on from some introductions from archivists and archive managers, because you've already heard about, you know, archiving, and there's all this potential in archives, and the same is true for animal sound archives. The British Library has a lot of recordings. They also have boxes and boxes of things they want to digitize. And so it's certainly important for data mining and archives. It's also important for monitoring. There are now lots of monitoring projects which monitor bird sounds live. Also important in comparative linguistics, bird song in particular, because birds learn their song analogously to the way humans learn their song. That's become an important analogy in the biological sciences to be studied to understand where human language came from, for example. So there are applications for it. There are reasons why you might, you know, give someone a grant to do some analysis of bird sounds. But I also want to emphasize that it's a great research challenge. So bird song as an object of study for someone who does signal processing and machine learning like me, it's absolutely fascinating. You know, all of us know how fascinating bird sounds are, and it does not become trivial if you're a signal processing machine learning person. There are still so many mysteries to be unraveled, let alone what the birds are saying to each other. I'm not trying to guess the meaning here, at least not yet. But to analyze these time series and to make sense of them, to organize them, to develop the algorithms that are going to help us make sense of bird sounds. So that's why, and that's why I think we should all be analyzing bird sounds. One of the first things you might think of, and one of the things that we often talk about, is bird species classification. So if I take a bird sound recording and I want to know what species of bird was that, if you talk to a machine learning person, they will say, well, that's just a classification task. This is it follows the form of things that are quite standard in machine learning. Here is some data. I want a label, and a hardcore machine learning person will not worry too much about what the data is. But it turns out in order to get this process to work, you really do have to spend some time with the material itself and get some, at least some intuition about how you're going to take the data and transform it into something that the algorithms are going to be able to work with. This is the feature representation in machine learning terms. What I've got here on the screen are just some little fragments. They're about 20 milliseconds each, and what this represents is the way our current algorithm analyzes large volumes of bird sounds and extracts regularities. These patterns are like little templates for what tends to happen in general in bird sounds. These features, such as here we have like a tiny little chirp of sound going downwards, but it's a harmonic chirp, and it's the particularities that come out that are different between music and speech and birdsong, for example. So this relates a little bit to Tim's question: can music analysis tools be used sort of transparently for speech analysis? And you know, the answer is yes and no. I certainly found that for analysing birdsong, you can't just take speech recognition software. That's not how it works. But yes, engineering the feature representation let us get to the point where, you know, we can actually release an app where we're recognising British birds just from mobile phone recordings. And, you know, it works well enough that I was not embarrassed about, you know, releasing an app. So there we go. Moving on from there, so moving on from the classification paradigm where we just say, I want this one label for this one file, there's actually a lot of things that you can ask of an algorithm about a sound recording. So a lot of my work at the moment is moving on from the classification paradigm, trying to get some more about the structure, the detail of an audio sound scene from the algorithms. One of the tasks we're looking at is something called weakly supervised learning or weakly labeled data. This is really common in all sorts of archives. You have a recording, the recording is labeled as being Blackbird and Robin. It doesn't say where in the recording is Blackbird and Robin. So a lot of machine learning algorithms need the sort of precise labels in order to learn what they're supposed to do. But there is a paradigm called weakly supervised learning where, despite only saying this is a Blackbird and Robin in the training data, we can say, okay, the Robin is here and the Blackbird is here. This is something that my student Veronica Morphy is looking at. I won't go into the details too deeply, except to say that she's doing one method which is deep learning and one method which is not. Another aspect that we're looking at in terms of structure is, so this is collaborative with a lab at Queen Mary and also the Max Planck Institute in Germany. We have zebra finches here. If I record the sound in their environment, zebra finches like to live in groups of, say, about 50. They're sort of colonial living birds. If you take a sound recording here, you've not just got individual atomized sound events, you've got a communication network. You've got a whole lot of sort of secondary information about the social structure, about what's going on in their lives. So what we want to do is start to develop algorithms that can make inferences about what's going on in there. So just iconically we can say we've got a number of individuals in a sound scene and they're each emitting events. So roughly analogous to speech recognition, you could say we can identify these events in a sound scene. Okay, maybe, let's just take that as read, we can identify the events. But what's going on there? Are the birds ignoring each other? Are the birds talking in pairs? Are they having a big conversation? And so what we do is we developed a model in which all of the birds sort of, it's a very abstracted model, but it represents the general idea that each of the birds has their own sort of ongoing state, and they are influenced by all these different timelines of other events that they can hear. And what we do with that model then is we need to develop a model that we can then make inferences about, that we can fit to data. We take this as a mathematical model, which I'm not going to go right into, but what we do is we learn from this the sort of the time course of interactions. If my colleague in bird terms calls at time 0, how does that influence my probability of calling at time 0.2 seconds later? And an example of the kind of results we get from this, with a small group of 4 zebra finches, we find that there's a sort of influence network which is consistent from day to day. So it's actually surprising when you talk to zoologists how little they know about the animals they work with. You know, I was talking to the ornithologist. You know, so what is a zebra finch social network? And they were like, well, we don't really know. They have stable mating partners, but within a larger colony, there's very little information about the sort of network we should see. So this is starting to use machine listening technologies to get what verging on being novel insights in animal behaviour and zoology. We have a network of influence that is stable over time in this group of birds. So that was a couple of examples. Well, I started with the classification paradigm, and then I gave you a couple of examples of how we're trying to go beyond that to sort of pulling out some more structure. And yes, so this is part of, we have a group at Queen Mary called the Machine Listening Lab, where we have a mixture of machine learning people, some zoologists, mathematicians, and other things. And yes, so I've already mentioned the collaborators that were particularly involved in the zebrafinch work. I think that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Working within this emerging field of soundscape ecology or ecoacoustics. Within ecoacoustics, which is a very recently framed term and emerging field, the sound is seen as both a resource and a source of information. So whilst bioacoustics has been studying sound as signal and meaning between creatures for a long time, these fields of soundscape ecology, which is the sonic version of a landscape ecology, which is looking at this very high, wide level, and trying to understand, in evolutionary terms, sound is a resource. So creatures need to hear each other in order to mate. Is the bottom line. Because it's a resource, they compete for it, and they therefore structure their environment. Yeah. So through competition, we structure our environment, which means that if we can learn to read back the environment, we can learn something from it, right? So the world affects me and I affect the world, and therefore the world is a kind of a history, a record of my interactions with it and my interactions with other things in it. So the logic of ecoacoustics within soundscape ecology is that actually this, similar to what Dan just mentioned, where a musical track is structured consciously in time in terms of beats and notes, etc., or maybe not, maybe in free improvisation, it's a little bit more around the hypothesis here, the acoustic niche hypothesis, which has been put forward by an ex-musician, in fact. The idea is that in a stable, healthy habitat, these creatures have been sharing this space and have learnt to play nicely, if you like, that there's an acoustic niche. So just in that they have a behavioural niche and a physical and biochemical niche. They have a sonic niche. So that this is a spectrogram. Hands up if you've never seen a spectrogram before. Okay, so this is time. It's like, you think of it like a heat map, like a topographic map. Time along here, frequency up here, and the brighter it is, there is more energy in that frequency band, right? So we could probably go around the room and try and recreate the sounds of this from the spectrogram. So the gibbons are going, there's some birds going, and there's some insects going up here, right? So that's then we've got maybe a bat. I'm not quite sure what is up there. There's up here, you can't even see, it's too low range, but this is probably like 0 to 20 kilohertz, something like that. Okay, so this kind of hypothesis, which isn't quite a scientific hypothesis, it needs a bit more work to make it kind of verifiable and testable, is that by listening to the overall structure, like a composition, like a whole orchestral arrangement, we can understand something about the ecological health of the habitat. Lovely. Okay, so if we could make some devices, some little micro computers that we could drop in, maybe with drones over the whole Amazon, and they could sit and listen in the trees and monitor, and then they could just text us every day or every week or every month the health of the habitat. And this would totally revolutionise biodiversity monitoring. We could look at the impact of oil drilling in the Amazon. We could look at the impact of our lovely new reserves we've made. We can have readily evidence-based land use policy, etc., etc. But the trick, of course, is that how on earth do we formalise that? So we might be able to look at this and say, and we might be able to listen to it. So Bernie Krause, this guy who came up with it, has said, yeah, I can listen to an environment. I can tell by listening to it, you know, how it is. Well, how on earth do we formalise that? That's a whole other line of research. So what in order to, like we developing any new tool, we compare it to an existing tool. Okay, so we have a ground truth, and we have a putative new measure that you want to validate, and we validate that by collecting a bunch of data, comparing the two, and getting a result. And this is what we've been working on. So we went out. We've got some sound recorders. We programmed them. You strap them to a tree. You program them to record 1 minute every 15. I also recorded the dawn and dusk and midday choruses just for kicks. And then you put a bunch of them out over 1 kilometre in woodland, in different habitats. And you do this in different situations. So we did it in ancient woodland in the UK, and a regenerating, rewilded farm, and a current farm, which is a monoculture crop. So we did that in the UK, and we also did it in Ecuador. There's not loads of these guys, but there are some. So we did it in primary Chaconne forest. We did it in secondary forest. These are some of our, he was the chief in the Amazon who helped us. And again, in a palm oil plantation, a kind of monoculture. So we've got a strong environment, a gradient across environment, we've got a gradient across time, we've got 2 ecotypes. So basically, we should have some shape in our data. And we've got loads of data. So we collected each of these sites, we collected 16 recorders for 10 days, recording 24/7. So we've got about, once we've cleaned it all up and just kept the mono versions, we've got 175,000 1-minute files. Okay, and then we want to look at some possible ways of measuring biodiversity through sound. Okay, that's our first question. Can we use sound as a proxy for biodiversity? And we developed some new audio features. So we've been talking a little bit about this already. And rather than doing anything nearly as complex as what Dan's doing, we're looking at really, really simple ones to begin with. So we might be, this is a time domain representation of sound, but it's a kind of an envelope of that. So we can describe this, we can create some statistical summaries of the time domain, and then if we also look in the frequency domain, we can kind of simplify it a little bit and think about the energy distribution. So here, this is just the same as, instead of being brightness on the y-axis, I've now got a bar chart. So this is again a sound which has got a lot of mid-range frequencies higher in it, and we compute a bunch of indices which describe. So indice here is the same as audio feature. Describe the frequency domain, and then we've got a whole bunch of numbers that we need to work out if they're real or not. And then we need something to compare it to, right? So we get some very dedicated and keen ornithologists, specialists, especially in Ecuador. There's only like one person who knows all the birds in that area, and they sit and they listen to about 2,500 samples of 1-minute audio files, and they give us essentially this for up to about 60 species. So in that 1 minute of recording, how many rufous motmots did they hear, and how many slate-throated whitestarts did they hear? And then we compare the two, right? So it's simple. You have an old way of measuring things, and you have a new way of measuring things, and you compare the two, and there you are. So you can do that. So you can look at a correlation, is the obvious thing. You say, what was the abundance? How many species were there in sample A, according to the person who sat and listened to it? And and if I look at that over my, how many, 2,500 is the subset of labeled data, do all the acoustic indices which were low valued, are they the same ones as the species distribution which is low valued? And yeah, for ecological data, it's pretty good. We're up in, this is 40, 80%, so this is like 60% correlations, and I haven't put stars on, but almost all of these which are high are significant correlations. So that's sort of good, but these are just summaries, so we can't really tell whether that is definitely telling us anything about the birds, or is there a correlation just because, I don't know, it was windy that day and the birds were quiet, or the human couldn't hear the recording because there was a plane going overhead, and so nor could the recorder. So there's a whole bunch of other stuff. We need to unpick it a little bit more. So then we might want to look at, instead of doing averages of it, we might want to look at all of the acoustic indices and all of the bird species. But we've got 26 indices and we've got 60 odd species. So like Dan was talking about, trying to visualize high-dimensional data sets is notoriously tricky, but there's some bit of maths we can do, and we can kind of reproject high-dimensional data sets. It's just a bit like having a shadow of your hand on the wall. I can turn my hand around until I can sort of see a sensible representation in 2D. So we can see there's structure in the bird species. So this was the primary, the secondary, and the palm oil plantation. So there's some structure there, so that's good. And we can also see some structure in the acoustic indices. So it's pretty messy, but for an initial look-see, there looks like there's some differences. So then what we can also do is build a model, and now we're starting to get on to really similar sorts of tools that we use in machine learning. So this is a part of a random forest type approach, and in ecology this is really nice because it can tell us not only was there structure in the species data set, was there structure in the acoustic data set, but of that variation, of the differences in the observed species across habitats, how much of that can be explained by the acoustic indices. So we can start to say, can the acoustic indices predict biodiversity, which is what we want in a tool, right? That's what we want from our new tool. So that all seems pretty cool. And then and what this also gives you, the random forest algorithm also tells you, it can kind of quantify the contribution of each of these indices to describing that. So that's great. And then what you do is you get a list out of it saying the variance of the RMS explained this much of the variance observed in the species, and this did this, and this did this, and this did this, and this did this, and like, that's great. And that's sort of what's generally reported, full stop, the end, thanks very much. But if we want to come back and say, well, but actually, what does the variance of the RMS, what does that really tell us in ecological terms? What does that really mean in terms of the changes in the composition of that bird community over time? Again, is it because of the bird species, the community composition? Is it something to do with the way the trees reflected sound? Is it something to do, again, with the other anthrophony, the noises that were made by nearby? We really need to be able to interpret these results. So it's not just enough, I would say, to make these statistical comparisons. We really need to understand what they mean. And then this is a bit problematic because necessarily to build a good model, we need enough data. We need so much data that it's beyond listenable compass. I can't go back and listen to 175,000 1-minute audio files. I've been trying. I put it on in the office and I put it on at home, and I'm trying to get a feel of, like, was there more tractors in the farmland, or, and this is the problem, right? This is always how we've done science. So, and it's the same with machine learning now. It's like these methods have been around for a really, really long time. But maybe, I'm not sure, but maybe what's happening is actually we're becoming further and further. We've got more and more and more and more levels of abstraction. Certainly that's true, say, of deep learning. So what we're studying, what we're interpreting, and what we're publishing is this kind of plot, slightly abstract plot of a statistical test or a kind of mean squared error or something, which summarises a sort of multivariate statistic, which is calculated on an audio feature, which in turn is derived from digital recording, which was made of the acoustic environment. Yeah, so we've got a visual representation or a single number that's representing a statistical summary of computational derivation of a digital representation of the acoustic environment, which in itself is only part of the actual rest of the community, right? Because they weren't all making a noise. There was loads of other birds that weren't doing anything, or worms, or caterpillars, all sorts of things. So it's not exactly a black box, but it's not terribly transparent, right? So we've got the world, and we're trying to learn something about it and understand it, and ideally predict it by making this model of it. But sometimes this gets a bit convoluted, and we can't necessarily get back and understand it and verify it. So one thing to say is that humanizing algorithmic listening might mean, and I'm warming, this is a prompt because you're going to be playing this later on, it might mean taking full responsibility for properly understanding the models that we're making and unpacking them and being able to interpret them. So what I'm planning to do next is to go from, and it strikes me, it is a bit ironic, and I think, Sharon, you brought this up in one of our workshops, we were saying, we want to treat audio as audio with oral history, but we're not. We're treating audio as a bunch of numbers and a scatter plot. So sometimes in this situation, in ecoacoustics and possibly in oral history as well, we actually want to listen. You know, all these ideas have come from listening, and as musicians or field recordists, it's really engaging. Like being situated in listening that's where you've learnt something from, by listening, right? And we need these kind of powerful statistical toys to play, or tools and toys to understand these big data sets. But if we're going to then apply those results for kind of impactful decision making, then I do think we need to take responsibility to understand them. And one way I'm thinking about doing that, it's a bit naff, but I'm calling it ecospectralism, is to think, well, can we then use methods from spectralist composition or experimental computer music, as well as possibly interactive arts and gaming, to create listening experiences that preserve the kind of rich, situated experience that we have when we're sitting in the field or we're playing music, but achieving the kind of oversight and perspective and the power of machine listening. So can we, instead of making statistical summaries of tests, can we make audio summaries? So very simple things of doing mean spectrum analyses and sonifying them, or are there more kind of sound-based statistical summaries that we can use that can give us this kind of overarching rapid exploration, but still kind of be engaged with it? So that's sort of something I'm thinking about next. And when Fiona mentioned, even the question of is half a tape silent? I mean, I guess visualizing that you could rapidly see, but there might also be all sorts of other tools, and maybe this is an errant machine listening algorithm, I'm not sure, other than just playing everything at high speed. You know, maybe there's some slightly more sophisticated ways of summarizing audio in the audio domain, so we can kind of rapidly hear things.
I'll talk a bit about various strands of work, and this presentation is about 90 slides, which I'm just going to basically flip through them very quickly, but hopefully give you a sense of why I've touched on many different aspects, stemming from audio analysis and visual analysis. I kind of grouped these two kind of modalities together in this kind of audiovisual way of understanding the world. And the way that I approached my research basically in the last 7 years is in the hopes of hardware and software catching up to this moment where basically I can put on some type of augmented reality device that understands all the objects in the world and can relate my perception of how I view and interact with the world to somebody else, and do that for both audition and vision. And so I've kind of approached that problem through a generative collage-based practice, so building a corpus of how it is that we analyze and understand the world, using theoretical understanding of how it is that humans actually do that in terms of both vision and audition. So starting with that rich theory, going into computation and building the analysis pipelines, understanding really that there's a lot missing from the theory when you start to move into computation. So there's a lot more questions that you have to ask. And then proceeding to an arts practice, basically, which is the synthesis component of that work. So I'll talk a bit about that. In lightning speed, here are things that interest me. I'm going to skip that. Kind of already mentioned that. More themes, definitely kind of stemming all the different strands of work. Somebody mentioned cybernetics. Definitely that should be up there as well. So this is the kind of breakdown that I mentioned before, going from this theoretical understanding, which basically is how is it that we act and interact in this world? What is it that we're looking at or listening to? What does the theory say about that? And attention has really been the focal point for that in terms of eye movements and EEG and fMRI, trying to understand how it is that we attend to elements in the world. And then moving from there into representation, which is the computational side of things, trying to model that process and see what it is that we're actually representing and how is that ongoing experience of the world aided by those representations. And then moving into synthesis, which is more the arts practice side of things. So I'll really pretty much just skip all of this. Eye movements, 3 to 4 times a second, we're moving our eyes. How is it that we're able to kind of build this scene understanding over time? I've looked at this video, might not play, interesting. I've looked with collaborators on how eye movements differ, for instance, in autistic and typically developing children, and use that to inform our understanding. There's a lot of great work in that space in visual cognition. There are kind of old school models of how attention might work, and I don't think many people believe this model anymore, but this is still a presiding way that visual cognition research had progressed for the last 15, 20 years. I think this is mostly obsolete now, but this was kind of starting point for attention when I started looking at attention in visual cognition. We moved into the dynamic domain by collecting a lot of, with my collaborators, a lot of videos of eye movements, 90 some videos, 200 some participants, really high sample rate binocular eye movement recordings, and then looked at all the different, this should play, hopefully. So if you've never seen eye movement data before, each one of these dots represent a different participant. And this is a kind of model of that, looking at the density of that. Again, a different type of model, and then just another visualization of that model. So you might be surprised to see how much convergence there is, how much movement there is. Yeah, fun. They're all online. You can go into vimeo.com/visualcognition. There are some 100 videos of those. Of eye movements. So we looked at all the different kind of standard ways of analyzing visual cognition and attention, looking at all the different visual features that psychophysical research had done, showing, for instance, static features like edges, luminance, color potency, Gabor-oriented filters from seminal research like Hugo and Wiesel. We looked at all that. And we also looked at dynamic features, like how the scene changes over time just by basically doing simple frame differencing, as well as using more computationally intense algorithms like image alignment over time or optical flow. We also look, this is more about the experimental psychology, how we came up with a baseline. Basically, we found that dynamic features were highly predictive of when participants were all more or less looking at the same place. So that, if you're familiar with exogenous or endogenous sort of attention processes, basically was showing that exogenous attention was highly predicted by these motion features. So that kind of informed this arts practice and trying to develop the synthesis process by basically recreating eye movements and using that to build proto-objects and attention, and using those proto-objects in this generative collage practice, which I'll skip over entirely. And there were some outputs of that, for instance, by doing artistic stylization, which maybe a lot of us are more familiar with a lot of the deep learning stuff that's become popularized. But this isn't using deep learning, this is using that sort of practice that I mentioned. And you can read more about that. I'm going to skip over it. But I think it's important to just kind of gloss over this because it really informed the audio side of things, where the same process basically was going from attention to representation to synthesis and seeing how it is that we listen what are the representations that we use, and how can I then use that to build a synthesis of that whole process and see what's missing. So this is just I think Chris is there in the back.
Yeah.
All right. All right, so into audio attention, I'm not going to talk about this. This is a slide I stole from somebody. I hope they're not in this room. But basically, cocktail party problem, how is it that we have all these multiple sources of sound kind of basically actuating this inside of our ear, this kind of binaural source that we could represent computationally as a signal. How is it that we're able to then think about the world in terms of this sort of nonlinear track editor view of multiple sources and recover that information? So that's the kind of interesting problem there. And similarly to the visual cognition domain, there is sort of audio attention models, and they sort of look like this, and that's interesting. But is it really the way that we do it? So similarly with the eye movement literature and trying to understand, what is it that we're looking at, you can use visual spatial attention to see the differences and the contribution that audio attention is providing by manipulating tasks. So you look at a video with audio and you look at a video without audio, look at the difference, and hopefully that will inform what is audio doing to our visual spatial attention. This is still all up on that visual cognition Vimeo. You can see a lot of this. There's a lot of research that's come out of this I won't talk about. I also looked at low-level features, so this is a lot more abstract. Rather than seeing like high-level endogenous sort of things, what about a complete mess of stuff which is totally abstract? And this is getting at temporal coherence and things like that Shihab Sharma and other prominent researchers know much more about than me. These are some low-level features that I analyzed as a result of a lot of those works. What audio features basically are contributing to when participants all look at the same location in a video. And it kind of had the reverse of the visual features where, that old chart that I showed you kind of had dynamic features. There was a lot of dynamic features happening. And that was indicated by this x-axis, which is representing when participants are all looking at the same location. So we find the opposite effect here. Audio features aren't changing when participants are all looking at the same location. So that might indicate basically the auditory object. There's some particular stream of information that we're all listening to. So that's a kind of constant feature over time rather than, things are different. So that might be, I don't know. That's just all a lot of hand waving, really. So in terms of representation, now that we have like some loose sense of theory and understanding of how it is that we might understand the world, how can we start to move to representation? I looked a lot at ERP literature, event-related potentials, which is basically using EEG. You have this cap and you're measuring electric potential in the scalp, and you present the participant some event many times. You average those events. So this might be 3 events that have been averaged. And there's very well-studied literature for the last 100 years describing these different components to attention and ongoing scene processing. These are called ERPs, and each one of these ERPs basically I found provided a computational model that I could then replicate to do ongoing auditory scene processing. So this was really great for me. I recommend the work of Istvan Winkler, plenty of others to learn more about that. I kind of grouped all of those four basic event-related potentials into this sort of model of event detection, segregation, integration, and template matching, which you can read more about in my thesis, and used along with that sort of theoretical framework, a computational model, which is source separation, a lot of us are more familiar with. So there's this sort of ongoing scene processing that's able to do segregation, integration, template matching, and principal latent component analysis is one method of performing this sort of segregation. when combined with, say, onset detection, we're able to kind of complete the loop of this sort of conceptual framework of how it is that we listen. So this is hopefully going to work, but probably not. So here's a complex scene. A lot of auditory sources, things pop out. You know, this is the cocktail party. So what grabs our attention? What's interesting? What is it that we're attending to, and what are the representations that we form while listening to this? Those are the questions that I'm asking. Using that kind of conceptual framework and using some source separation, blah, 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 you can, this doesn't sound very good, but it's something. So according to this theoretical model and my really bad computational model, that would be the things that we're basically segregating as background. And the things that will foreground, things that we attend to, would be this. And you can, because it's a source separation technique, you can basically add these two sources and you get back the original audio. Okay, so moving into synthesis, I really liked the work of Michael Casey, who I went on to do a postdoc with, and he had this nice little chart which described sound spotting, and there have been lots of different variants of this. Basically, in real time, you're analyzing some sound, you do some segmentation, and you're trying to match whatever it is to some known corpus of sound. And for me, my interests were in perception. How is it that I'm relating ongoing scene perception to things that I've already stored, things that I've already learned about? And how am I creating that corpus in real time? So I basically just kind of added an arrow there and made this app, which nobody liked, everybody hated, but you can download it. And it sort of does this sort of thing where in real time, you start with an empty corpus, and it's learning sounds, it's adding them to the corpus, and it's matching things that it hears at any given moment to the things that it's already learned and stored. So that was an interesting process for me. Here's another example of that. I'm loading up an audio file, and in real time, it's clustering the sounds, and I can perform them back as well, rather than just listen to it as a matching exercise. So over time, it became a lot less about perception and attention and more of here's a fun instrument. Give the people what they want, So, here's David Attenborough creeping behind a lyrebird, and this I'll try and show. Maybe this won't work. Nope. All right. Well, never mind. This is probably more interesting for many of you studying archives. So this is an archive of 60 hours of Daphneorum. Brilliant. I highly recommend you check out Daphneorum's work if you're not familiar with Daphneorum. But basically there was some 60 hours of tape reels that had been digitized, and researchers of the archive wanted to know what was in the archive. So what you can do is apply source separation to the archive using this sort of machine listening model that's doing event detection, trying to find common components or templates of sounds based on that kind of segregation and integration idea. And then each of the axes that are drawn here, all 45 have been automatically learned, are basically different timbre profiles, the different sources that it found, although it's, there's also combinations of those, so it's not necessarily true that there's only 45. That's just, one way of analyzing it. And there are much better ways of doing this now, I realize. Okay, so moving into kind of my original aim, which is augmented reality, thinking about sound source and localization, it's really important to keep the idea of spatialization intact. And the first thing that I wanted to do when I first started my PhD in 2010 was to actually build an app called Sonic Graffiti and store the sources of sounds in location based on GPS and relocalize, respatialize those monaural sound sources using this sort of same mashup, cut-up, collage process. And so there are great ways to do that with binauralization. But, I'll skip over all this actually. So yeah, that's pretty much the culmination of this led to audiovisual smash-ups, which basically in real time, sorry, not in real time, but analyzing a video, you can then recreate that video using other content. And this is work that actually started with Chris Kiefer. What was it called? Spam? Yeah, so you can learn more about that. That's called YouTube Smash Up. From there, I got really interested in the brain. I wish I had more access to things like fMRI and MEG, because there you can start to understand the actual representations that we are using. So I worked with Michael Casey and did a postdoc with using fMRI to understand what encodings we might use to understand music. And my interests were more to do with sound, although he was investigating music, so this was a great opportunity to get experience with fMRI and understand more about the brain. So we designed this experiment, Jessica Thompson, Bo Sievers, and Michael Casey. Jessica designed the experiment where you have these sort of alternating blocks where, okay, I'll listen to different scales, and then I'll try to imagine them. And there will be ascending and descending blocks. And this is sort of the presentation, the way that you were presented in the scanner. And these are the sort of activations that we found in the brain. So, no surprises really here, except for maybe the imagined, we were using the insular gyrus for some reason. And here's more pretty pictures. And the fun stuff, which was after having built a model, computational model, using the known representations, you can then decode. So in goes a sound source. We look at the brain activations. We can then use any new brain activation or unseen brain activations to imagine with the computational model what they might be listening to or what they might be imagining. And so here are some, pretty charts that show that. That's it. Thank you.